Welcome back, everybody, to episode 52 of The Hopeful Majority. And it's not just another episode. This is the 1 year anniversary of the show. If you're new, welcome to The Hopeful Majority. Every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we basically have nuanced, productive conversations with people that are very different from our perspectives, share different dialogues, different insights, and importantly, we oftentimes expose how the media is dividing us on the show. I really appreciate you joining because we're building this hopeful majority together. And this majority consists not of political moderates, but of people that believe we have to be open minded, engaged, curious. And if you're old to the show, have been supporting the show, thank you. Because of you, we are here where we are today. And the goal is to continue growing this thing. Today, we've got on a guest, Isaac Saul, the founder of a media organization called Tangle. Tangle is a newsletter that has grown significantly over the last couple of years. It now has 100,000 subscribers. It's an independent, nonpartisan newsletter where Isaac shares the takes on the left, on the right, and then his take on a news issue. I think it's really important to hear about and learn about new media organizations that are trying to disrupt what I call, and what you've heard me say, is the outrage economy, the outrage industrial complex. The fact that a lot of us, a lot of the people that are listening to the news, and also a lot of the folks that are producing news are driven oftentimes by the outrageous news stories, by the clicks. And Isaac's newsletter is disrupting that. And so we've talked about the problem a lot over the last couple episodes. Let's bring on one of the people that is leading the solution to the problem. This is a fascinating conversation. I think you'll appreciate it. No monologue this time. Why? Because I think you've heard me speak enough over the last couple of episodes, just monologuing it up. So I appreciate you hanging in there. Here's an awesome conversation. I learned a lot from this one, and I hope you check it out. Let's roll in to the conversation with Isaac Saul. Isaac Saul, welcome to the Hopeful Majority, sir.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So, are you feeling hopeful already, especially as you run a national, independent, nonpartisan newsletter about the media?
Yeah, I feel hopeful. I mean, I am, oscillating between despair and hopefulness pretty regularly. I think like a lot of Americans probably are, but I am certainly hopeful about some of the potential out there for media organizations. I'm hopeful about the fact that I think the country is kind of bottomed out in terms of partisanship. And I'm hopeful that the presidential election will be over in a few months and we can go back to talking about other things that are probably more important.
I think that's unlikely, but I hope you're right. Let's actually. So, as the audience just heard in the introduction, I talk a little bit about your background and what you've been focused on, what you do, and you actually had me on your podcast now almost I think 9 or 10 months ago. But then the reason why I sent you this email, if you remember, after actually Elon Musk responded to one of your tweets. And importantly, that tweet was about October 7th. And we'll get into that a little bit later on in the show. But he basically said, this is a good piece. And you responded to him saying, hey, we've got this national independent newsletter. This is what we're building. And I want to specifically read just the byline of the newsletter and ask you, why are you actually doing this? Of all the things that you could be doing, why this? So the way you describe it is, Tangle is an independent, nonpartisan, subscriber-supported politics newsletter that summarizes the best arguments from across the political spectrum. That, to me, friend, today sounds like a pain in the head. Why this? Why are you pursuing this right now?
Yeah, so I have kind of two genesis stories that I like to talk about in terms of how I got to where I am and where Tangle is now. The first one is that I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is a bellwether county in a bellwether state. And, the way Bucks goes, Pennsylvania goes, the way Pennsylvania goes, the election goes. But, when I was in high school, CNN was coming to like my town to do the diner interviews with voters and figure out whether they, who they were going to vote for. The reality of living in a place like that is that your friends and family, your teachers, all the people you interact with in your day-to-day life, they're very mixed politically. It's not like living in a rural place in Oklahoma. It's not like living in Brooklyn, New York. You encounter people who coexist with really different political views. And as I got older and went through college and Obama got elected and we sort of steamrolled towards the 2016 election in the post-Obama era, I saw that community fray in a way that I wasn't really accustomed to seeing.
In
And that
Bucks
was
County. This
surprising
is
to
a
me.
community
Yeah,
in
in
Bucks
Bucks
County.
County, the friends, family, relatives, the way people were interacting about politics, how angry it got, how divided it got, all of that was a sort of early warning shot for me that I was seeing on the ground, just how ugly things got sort of towards the end of Obama's years going into the kind of the Trump Hillary election. So one core part of all this is just that I have people whom I love and care about and feel a great deal of empathy for and understand really deeply who don't agree politically. And so I see the humanity in them and I understand how they've come to their views and I understand why they feel the way they feel. And I relate to them in a lot of ways. And I just feel well positioned to do the work that I'm doing in some sense, just by my upbringing and, you know, sheer fortune, luck about where I grew up and who my social circle was. The second Genesis story is that I went looking for the product that Tangle has become today and I couldn't find it. And that's like the classic entrepreneurial story is like if you want something, you know, and you go looking for it and it's not there, you should make it because you're probably not the only person who wants it. So, you know, I've been a politics journalist for 10 years. I was a sports reporter in college. I worked at the school newspaper at the University of Pittsburgh, and then I lived in Israel for a little bit. And then I came home to start my professional reporting career in politics. And I used to go looking for answers about a story, you know, one specific question, say Donald Trump proposes building a wall on the southern border. And my experience, in order to understand that story and to be sure that I heard all the different really strong arguments for and against it, was I would go read the New York Times, I'd go read the Wall Street Journal, just their straight news sections. Then I'd read the opinion sections from both. Then I'd open Washington Post. Then I'd read Fox News. Then I'd read Huffington Post. Then I'd
You
listen to
sound like
Ben
just an
Shapiro's.
average consumer of American politics.
Yeah,
This
right.
is what everybody
Exactly.
does, right?
Yeah, and then I listen to Ben Shapiro's podcast, and then I, you know, listen to the Turks or whatever they're called. And then I go back and forth, and I, you know, 12 hours later after doing all this research, I sit down on my computer to write a piece myself, or maybe to start reporting out a piece. And in my head, I'm thinking, okay, now after doing all that work, I think I have a pretty good understanding of what the strongest arguments people are making, you know, on the left, the right, the moderate left, the moderate right, the fringes, all their perspectives and arguments. And I can sort of condense that for myself and, you know, make it more concise in my writing. But I have a grasp of those perspectives. But it took me 12 hours and I had to go to 45 different places to get it because you're not going to get the right's best argument from the New York Times opinion page, and you're not going to get the left's best argument from the Wall Street Journal opinion page. And so I wanted to find a place where I could go do that, where I could find that. And when I went looking for that place that had a collection of all these views in one spot, there were very, very few places that were doing it. And the very, very few that were, I didn't think were doing it very well. And so I decided I was going to try and do that. And that was the initial concept for the Tangle newsletter, was break down one big story and then go out and do all this research, finding arguments from the left and the right, and sort of work from the center left and the center right out to the fringes, and then share a summary of those arguments with my readers. So any given person could have a really wide, holistic view at individual issues. And that was the very core component of the first newsletter I sent to 13 people almost 5 years ago.
5 years ago, that was what, 2019. So this was sort of peak President Trump's presidency, and now going into sort of the 2020 election, right?
It was August of 2019, just as the Democratic primaries began.
Okay. What about you as a political journalist made you particularly inclined to actually go through this process of understanding the best arguments on the left, understanding the best arguments on the right, and then trying to summarize this into something that the audience could consume? Because to me, that seems like a process we all should undertake, and yet that's not the case, or at least it seems like it's not the case, because I would imagine, as a layperson consuming the news, not somebody producing the news or writing the news, that most people are not being so deliberate about their media consumption. And in fact, they're going after a source, and then that's sort of their filter. What about you as a person do you think makes you particularly capable of doing that? Or do you think everybody else is going through that process and they're just not talking about it?
I think everybody else is capable of doing it. I think that I was not very good at it in the beginning, what sort of spurred me to do it was my experience working for different news outlets and kind of seeing how the sausage was made on the inside, and the way, a headline would change or an image would change or a story would get edited to be a little bit more inflammatory or a little bit more, persuasive in the way that it was formatted. There are all sorts of little things that I think news outlets do that have ideological tilts that shape the way the news comes out, that I was seeing that felt a little icky to me. And that made me want to, open my mind to some other perspectives I may have dismissed before. And
Can you actually dive deeper into how the sausage is made in the newsroom? What about that process surprised you or shocked you?
sure. And I don't want to, first of all, I don't want to make it seem like this is this great big sinister thing. I think what happens in a lot of newsrooms is, audience capture and ideological capture. So, the editor of a politics news outlet, the political vertical at a news outlet is hiring people who they like. And they're hiring people who have similar worldviews as them or have similar connections as them. They know them professionally. A reporter comes in with a recommendation from a friend. And that creates a kind of ideological consistency that exists in a lot of newsrooms that produces a certain kind of news that might have an ideological bent. So that's one. And then two is, if you're the New York Times and you publish a story on your homepage about, Donald Trump breaking some law, and then you also publish a story on your homepage about Donald Trump doing something to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, and you see that the story about him breaking the law gets 1 million clicks and drives 1,000 new subscribers, and the one that, is about him lowering the price of drugs gets, 500 clicks and drives 1 subscriber, what are you going to do more of? You're going to report more on the stuff about him doing all the illegal things and being a bad, dangerous president. And so all these pressures exist at newsrooms in various ways. And I think they manifest in these kinds of like ideological tilts that we see. So, from my perspective, my first job was at the Huffington Post, classic left-wing, liberal bent news outlet. I did not start working at the Huffington Post because I was a diehard progressive. I think back then I definitely had more liberal than conservative views when I started working there, but that's not why I took the job. I took the job because I applied to 40 other places and one of them offered me a job, and it was the Huffington Post. So I got paid $38,000 to live in New York. It was not some big glamorous slam dunk job. I was grinding and trying to start my career. Huffington Post was awesome for a lot of reasons. It was a huge newsroom, lots of experienced editors, tons of resources. They did really hard-hitting journalism that was focused on being critical of conservatives and, conservative politicians and conservative thought leaders. And that's fine. There's a place for them, just like there's a place for Fox News in the ecosystem. But what I saw there internally was everybody who worked there was liberal and progressive. I guess it was a 300-person newsroom, so I don't know everybody, but I would say pretty much everybody that I encountered and based on how they interacted with each other and talked about the news in private was liberal. And when I submitted stories or I, published a piece or pitched a story, I would see the way that the story would change or my pitch would change. So, I might want to write about a Republican politician who was doing something really good, made some productive infrastructure bill that got a lot of money for a certain community. And I pitch that story, and the response I get from editor is, what if we did that story and we paired it with something about, what this Democratic politician did in this other state to just make sure that we're showing that both Democrats and Republicans. And I'm all right. Yeah, sure. That's fine. But like, pitch a story about a Democrat getting an infrastructure bill passed, and you're not going to get that response from the editor. It's different. You have a headline about, something a Republican politician did that's maybe a little bit bland, not very interesting. And then there are a bunch of superlatives and adverbs that get added to the headline to make it sound scarier and more clicky because they want to drive traffic, and that gets people in the article. And now we know, 10 years later, this was the Facebook era, but now we know back then, the vast majority of readers were sharing articles without even reading them. They were just sharing them based on the headline and the image. Not something we knew then, but something we know now. All these different things, these different pressures and influences I saw and made me understand that there was probably a better way to do this and that I could maybe execute
Mhm.
it. And so that's sort of what I set out to do.
So we'll get a little bit into the product that is Tangle, but I think this is laying a really good foundation for why. And that's actually some of the core best conversations I've had in the show, Isaac, have focused on the why, because oftentimes I think we live in this world where we automatically attach judgments, critiques, opinions to people without actually understanding why they're doing what it is they're doing. So you identify two sort of broad pressures, right, that the newsroom faces. The first was that this notion of audience capture, but importantly, the way that the sausage is made is oftentimes informed by the friends that you hire into the newsroom or the people that are in your circle. So there sort of becomes this ideological consistency. And the second part is sort of the business model itself, right? Like what story gets clicks, and that's what I would produce more of. So let me just focus on the first one for a quick second. The more sinister version of that first point is that there's a cabal in the media, right? Or that there's collusion between political officials and those in the newsroom, that editors are being pressured or being bought, right? That's you see that a lot on the left and the right. This claim is now coming more and more. How much truth do you think that has? And versus how much of it do you think is genuinely just you develop a rigid audience over time, that's what you appeal to, and naturally human tendencies to go in that direction? How do you parse through the credibility of those two different versions of that same story?
Yeah, look, I mean, on net, I would say it's way, way more the latter. It's way more
Mhm,
ideological rigidity that exists in newsrooms and sort of the unintentional output of the way newsrooms are built and the kind of business pressures people experience. Do media people all talk to each other offline and go to the same parties and exist in the same social circles? Yes, definitely. Do executives at CNN and NBC and Fox News and CBS and ABC, do they all compete for the same audience and talk to each other and share certain ideas about, how are we going to cover X, Y, or Z? How are you guys handling this? And then make decisions based on that? Of course. I mean, the same way industry leaders in any industry talk, I mean, owners in the NFL and the NBA have relationships and invest in each other's teams and, share insights and ideas and, how they're going to change the rules and processes, all these things. I mean, every single industry has that. So it's true, but I think it's less sinister than people think. This idea that there's this group of media leaders who all sort of, coalesce around certain ideas. I think, another thing that's also true is it's really easy to go where the story is. And when you see one media outlet go there or 10 media outlets go there and you see their ratings and you see their success and you see them all getting a bunch of
mhm.
traffic, that pushes you to do that thing, So CNN, famously sort of pivoted from a more neutral kind of stance that it had 10, 15, 20 years ago to being more of a response to Fox News, which Fox News was a response to CNN. And so they got in this cycle where it's, the whole point of Fox News is to give this television cable news outlet that speaks to a conservative audience, because in a lot of conservatives' opinions, that didn't exist. And then CNN sees the success of Fox News not being like center left, but being center right, but being very clearly overtly conservative. And they start being very clearly overtly liberal. And so it sort of feeds into each other. And that is, part of the toxicity of the moment we live
Mm.
in. And I think part of the big problem. But it's less people in a dark, smoky room deciding what to do and more, the same kind of motivations that exist in every industry, which is, profit and ratings and success and, the kind of bubble that a lot of these executives live in and the fact that they all talk to each other and exist in similar social circles. I mean, those are the
Mhm.
things that sort of, when you see every mainstream news organization get a story wrong, it's because of those kinds of things. It's not necessarily because they're all trying to, fool the American people and they're evil.
So you said that the pressures that exist in this industry exist in many others: profit, ratings. You got to make money. You got to keep the lights on, and not only that, but you want to be able to produce news stories, right? So naturally, that brings the second question, which is there a world in which you can align the business model to be aligned with the desire to have not necessarily objective news, but nonpartisan coverage, right? Like, is there a way to bridge the gap so that people aren't forced to make the what seems like an exclusive choice between pursuing profit and money and being in an arms race to drive up ratings and actually deliver people a product that it seems like they actually want, which is unbiased coverage or relatively nuanced coverage of different issues?
Yeah, so this is kind of where I get into my consumer criticism and away from my media criticism. So
Okay.
I think what a lot of people want to hear is this idea that, news organizations could just change and give people what they want. As you just said, they give people the kind of nonpartisan, more even-handed news, and then they'll have these successful businesses that will grow and flourish and they'll change the game. I am certainly not convinced that that's what people want. And I think if people want that, they need to start acting like it. And I'm speaking specifically to consumers. I have a very optimistic story to tell about Tangle, and I'm sure that we'll talk a bit about that and how I've tried to build my
Yep.
business model in order to align with our values and ethos. And I think we're doing it successfully on a small scale. But the reality, people always complain to me, like friends and family or people I meet. I tell them I'm a journalist. They're like, God, the news sucks. Like, why is it so negative? Like all I do when I
Man,
turn
you've
on the 6
ruined
o'clock.
every opportunity to go to a party for the rest of your life. It's like, I'm a
Yeah.
journalist. Party immediately shuts down.
Yeah. And it's always a very similar thing. It's like, I turn on the 6 o'clock news, or I go to New York Times, or I watch Fox News, or whatever it is, and it's always awful and depressing and all that stuff. And my answer is the same as that New York Times hypothetical, with the Trump story about doing something illegal and lowering prescription drug prices. It's if you go to CNN.com and there's two stories on the homepage right next to each other, and one is about a bus crash that just killed 20 kids, and one is about a healthcare bill that just saved, every American $2,000. What story are you clicking on? And if the answer is the bus crash, which for most people it is, then change your behavior. Because if you want media organizations to invest more of their resources and time and money into the thing that you say everybody wants, we need some consumer led behavioral change too. We need signals from our audiences that those things are things they actually desire and actually want. Because I can choose to do that on a small scale in my business model and be successful. But the reality is CNN can't. They need traffic. They need ratings. They need to do those things to fund the other parts of their journalism, to fund the other parts of their newsrooms. And I think a lot of American consumers don't necessarily understand that. So I think it's easy as a consumer to blame all these media organizations and say it's our fault for shoving all these things down our throat. But I think the reality is a lot closer to newsrooms are responding to the signals they're getting from their readers. And if you are somebody who wants that to change, you should think about every click and every second, every minute you stay on a news channel as giving away $5, $10 to that media organization. That's what you're doing. Every time you click on an article, boom, you just gave that article money. Every time you leave the TV on while some news report's breaking, you're giving that media outlet money. So think about it that way and then act accordingly. And I think if a lot more people start doing that, we see some newsrooms get that signal that there's craving for more in-depth reporting, there's craving for more nonpartisan news, then that's going to help sort of force the issue. What's happening at CNN right now is informative. They've laid off a ton of people. They clean house on a lot of their major anchors. They have a new president. All these things have happened in the last year because their ratings started to fail because all they were doing was anti-Trump stuff every single night over and over, and audiences got tired of it. So now they're changing. They're not doing that out of some altruistic, decision, but they're doing it because it stopped working. And that's good. I'm glad it stopped working because it sucked and I can't watch CNN anymore. But, it's a powerful symbol of how the audience reaction and acceptance of this stuff can actually change the way a newsroom functions.
I just want to pin something you said, which is your attention makes them money. Every time you spend some time on something, you're actually making the money. You should be asking yourself, do I want to be making this thing this money in the way in which they're covering that? And we actually just talked about this, Isaac, last episode about how the consumer and us are actually driving the incentive structures in some way. It's like the junk food companies. We complain, why does Lay's make so much money? Well, stop eating so many damn Lay's chips, right? Like yesterday, we went out to a rager, right, where we played Die in Golden Gate Park to celebrate and just have a good long weekend. And you know what we bought? We didn't buy 3 buckets of strawberries. We brought 4 bags of Lay's chips and 5 bags of Doritos, which we went through and cleaned house on. So where that brings me is, if you are the strawberry to our junk food, if you are the healthy food, if you are giving consumers hopefully what maybe they should be having, how is the market responding?
Yeah. So look, from my perspective and my experience in building Tangle, there's a huge, huge thirst for what we're doing. We run into some challenges that, you'd probably expect. You hear about a news organization where we explain a story in really neutral terms, and then we share the left's take and the right's take, and then I give my own personal opinion in every newsletter. We're going to piss people off. And when you piss people off, they do emotional things like cancel their subscription, write in an angry email, leave the newsletter. That happens. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't happen. The other side of the coin is, we have over 100,000 people on our mailing list now. We have an incredibly engaged audience. I mean, 60% open rates on our emails, which is industry best. We have a YouTube channel, a podcast, these things that we're branching off of this main core offering with the newsletter that people are really interested in. And we have tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of testimonials from people about how reading Tangle has reduced stress in their life, allowed them to talk to their uncle or niece or whatever who has a different political view than them, help them in their marriage because they're married to somebody who has different political views than them, help them better understand the other side, made them realize they were stuck in a bubble and, weren't actually seeing the best arguments from people who they disagreed with politically, made them feel more hopeful about the future of the country, or in some cases, confirm their prior beliefs, but now they felt like they had a more holistic understanding of why they felt the way they feel and what the other side's argument was. And they're more equipped to sort of deal with that and navigate it. So, it's not, my goal is not to make everybody hold hands. This is not like, oh, we're going to unify the country and all this stuff. I hope that happens in some small way, but really it's about just understanding and tolerance. It's about being able to say this person disagrees and being agreeable while you disagree. I mean, those are the kind of things that I want to come out of it. So the market response for us has been great. I mean, I was making, $70,000 a year as a senior editor at my last job before I started Tangle. And the newsletter makes that in a month now. So, I've gone from struggling as a reporter and working 3 different jobs to pay rent and save up money and having a full-time job and freelancing and tutoring and, going from that to hiring 5 full-time employees for a media company. I created journalism jobs, and I did that on this premise, on this ethos. So from where I'm sitting, it's a really, really positive outlook. And there's a really strong business model that we have that I think is scalable and kind of speaks to, where the country is as a whole, that people are really craving this. To be fair, we get 100,000 people on our mailing list. Sean Hannity has 2.5 million people watch his show every night. So we're still small fish compared to some of the big pundits who are kind of dominate the narrative, making class and all that stuff. But we're also new. And, we're coming up on 5 years old. We're still growing. We're still kind of in a quote unquote startup phase. We've done it with no investors, totally bootstrapped, no big funding, all organic growth. So I feel really good about where we are. I feel like we're getting a really strong signal that there's a lot of desire for this, and we're seeing tons and tons of people enter the space, which is the final thing I'll just say is we have competitors, more competition now than we've ever had. And that to me is a signal that a lot of people are interested in this kind of news and want this kind of bubble popping. They want to get out of the bubble they know they're in.
Yeah, I mean, when we had our catch-up call last week, when I'd reached out, one of the things that I'd said was that it is amazing to see the ecosystem of disruptive media organizations growing, and that these media organizations like yours are providing consumers an alternative. And the fact that the consumers, us, the people listening to the show, are actually responding, saying, "Hey, I want that," is a really positive signal. Where my mind goes to is, I wonder how high the ceiling is. Like, I'm curious whether this total addressable market of people that want to hear nuanced, consumable information, what I call the hopeful majority people, like, I wonder if that's higher than the total addressable market for a right-leaning outlet like Fox News or a left-leaning outlet like CNN. How do you think about that? Do you think that at the end of the day, if you continue on your trajectory, you could actually beat out the amount of people that are listening to the extremes? I'm curious what your theory is.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's a core question that we have to ask about, how to scale our business and where to go next. I would say not only do I think it's bigger, I think a lot of those people, a good chunk of those people who are the Fox News, CNN watchers who, religiously read left or right leaning outlets, I think they are capturable. I think we can
Oh,
get through to
interesting.
them and that there are people who can be reached because,
Yeah,
I don't think that.
could you drill down on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I know it. We advertise on conservative and liberal channels sometimes. We spend our limited advertising budget to target people who are already political junkies. That's one of the, kind of have two audiences. One is like the people who have 10 minutes a day to understand what the hell is going on, which is really hard. We want them, like moms with 4 kids, dads who are in grad school, grandparents who are retired and just want to read one email a day and relax. We want all those people to come in, but we also want to get to the political junkies. And so, we'll advertise in National Review or something like a stalwart conservative magazine or Daily Costs, a place that's really liberal, whatever. And we get those readers. And then what happens is they'll see us cover something and they'll see Fox News or New York Times or whatever else also cover the same thing. And they'll see how the coverage is different and they'll understand that they're getting a fuller picture from the way that we're doing it. And that makes them feel like the place they had been going to the news is not telling them the whole story. And that's a really crappy feeling. And so, I have people who write in and say, I just canceled my New York Times subscription today to buy a Tangle subscription. Or I used to watch Fox News every night. I've been reading your newsletter for a year and I just gave up on it because like they're crazy. Those emails exist in my inbox. So I know that there are people there who are movable, who we can break out of that kind of ideological cell that they're in. At the same time, I think, the biggest market opportunity for us is the people who are disengaged. They're the people who see everybody fighting and have really politically engaged friends who just like never shut up about politics and it's just annoying, or they're always fighting amongst each other, or they have parents who watch Fox News every night and they just seem crazy and angry all the time. And they're like, I want nothing to do with any of this. Like, I'm good with ESPN.com or, reality TV or whatever it is, and just like get me out of here. And those people feel that way, I think, for a really justifiable reason, which is like the news sucks. It doesn't feel good to spend an hour on the New York Times homepage. It doesn't feel good to watch Fox News for a night. You leave, like I do it every day, and you leave those things feeling really tight and angry and like the world's burning, and it's not a good feeling. And I understand why people don't want to do that. We're not trying to sugarcoat what's happening in the world, but I think there's a way to deliver informative, important news that isn't always a recurring 5-alarm fire. And when you have the kind of gray and not just the black and white about the news, I think it makes it a lot easier to process what's happening and to decide how you want to act on it. And I think when you get the news in an email and it takes you 10 or 15 minutes a day, or you listen to our podcast and it takes 25 minutes, and then you can turn it off and leave it and go about your day, that's totally okay. Like you should be able to do that. We want people to do that because, everybody has lives to live. They've got kids to raise, jobs to keep, all this stuff. I don't expect people to be thinking about the war in Gaza for 8 hours a day because it's, we all have to deal with our communities, the things that are right in front of us. And I think a lot of the news and a lot of the media sort of puts this puts this pressure on people, like this is the end of democracy, this is the world's ending, the immigrants are coming, whatever it is. Everybody has their own narrative about like how the country's burning to the ground. And if you take all that in constantly, then it's totally consuming. There's nothing else you can do but that. And I think just the tone and the tenor and the approach that we have is something that allows people who might otherwise be disengaged to sort of engage and come back and feel like they can have a healthy relationship with the news, which is a really important part of it.
So first, I want to address the audience that's listening to this that says, I love everything that Isaac just said. Here's my question. How do I trust you to provide that fuller picture? And maybe a sharper version of that question is, how do you determine what is the left's take? What is the right's take? When you're going through your newsletter, for folks' context, and you can visit this on, if you Google Tangle, you see quick hits, then you see here's what the left's saying, here's what the right's saying, and then here's Isaac's take. How do you go through that process? And why should people trust you?
Look, first of all, nobody should trust me. They should come in with an open and skeptical mind and read our content, and they can decide whether, they want to sort of give us the benefit of the doubt or not. Sharing my opinion is not my way of saying this is the right thing or the wrong thing, or I'm right and everybody else is wrong. It's an act of transparency. I want people to know where I'm coming from, because I am the source that they're getting their news from. Now, we have a whole team that researches and edits the newsletter, and so it's obviously not just me, but the idea is that I'm saying these are my priors I come to this with. Here's how I view these different arguments. You can take my opinion or leave it. The way that we collect the arguments, I mean, is just an
sorry, Isaac, before you go to the process, I just want to hold on something there before you sort of just skip over it, because I think what you just said there is something really important, which is that as someone that analyzes the media, you're saying that actually I want to lay out my take there so that you as an audience member can transparently understand what it is that I'm saying and then make your own decision. And I think that type of radical honesty, which is, I think, it's a phrase I've seen you use a lot in your tweets and some newsletters about you being radically honest, is, I think, something that a lot of media pundits could learn from, and I bet is a breath of fresh air for a lot of people listening to this. So feel free to go through your process, but I think that's really important, is to say this is what Isaac thinks, and so now I know what he's saying, and so I'm going to continue reading his newsletter.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's first of all, it wasn't something I intended to do when I started Tangle. I started the My Take section because people would respond to the really early newsletters, like when it was just friends and family and I was kind of testing the waters, and they'd be like, yeah, but what do you think? Like, you're like the political journalist. Like, I want to know your opinion on these things. I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then I realized it gave me this space to sort of share my own view, so I could leave all the bias stuff. It allows me to be more neutral everywhere else in the newsletter, because I have this little spot where I can give my own opinion. And then, yeah, it's radically transparent and it's radically honest, because my promise to people about my take and what I'm doing with that section of the newsletter is not that I'm going to be centrist. It's not that I'm going to be moderate. So oftentimes I am sort of come out in a more moderate gray, not black and white area, but it's that I'm going to be honest about how I actually feel. I'm going to tell you what I truly think, and I'm going to explain how I got there. And I think that explanation is the really important part of the newsletter and the podcast. And what I get from readers who disagree with me is a lot of like, you sound like a liberal, but you're my favorite liberal in the world. I don't hold it against you because you're so honest about it. Or, I can tell you're a closet Trumper, but at least you told me how you got there, and you're the most reasonable conservative I've ever read. Those are the kinds of responses I get from people who are holding in different places than me. It's not like you're a scumbag reporter who's, hiding his biases and trying to deceive your readers. It's, I think, like they recognize.
That's actually the worst of all worlds, is when I think someone claims a platform of neutrality, but is actually very biased. And I bet that if people are calling you a closeted Trumper, and a closeted Biden voter at the exact same time, I think you're doing something right. So then naturally the question becomes, when you operate in that gray area of radical honesty, you're trying to thread the line, but also providing your take. Do you ever, and frankly, I've seen this critique of yours and our work in the comment section. So I'm curious how you respond to this. How do you respond to the critique that you're actually not saying anything? You know what I mean? That your take is so watered down that are you actually saying anything, or are you just laying out the facts? How do you respond to that when someone on the extreme left or the extreme right hits you with that?
Yeah, I think it's a silly criticism. I mean, being able to say I'm unsure or I don't know or this issue is really complicated and I feel a little bit more this way, but this part of the story is sort of keeping me up at night and I can't totally let it go. That's embracing the complexity and the nuances of the world that we all live in. And 95% of the issues that we have really divisive, really, really heated debates about are really divisive and really heated because a bunch of well-intentioned, decent people can look at the exact same set of facts and feel really, really differently. And like you have to be able to see that the more that you read and the more you take in and the more information you encounter, that there's no world in which a lot of these issues are so simple that the people who are just taking one hard partisan line are the ones who are quote unquote saying something or doing something of value. So my response to that kind of feedback is often, do you have a criticism about my arguments I laid out or how I ended up leaning on this position or that? Or is it just that you don't like that I am acknowledging the people who disagree with me?
Hmm.
Like that is, there's a different critique there. Like if somebody writes in or comments on something and they're like, hey, you said this, which strikes me as wrong because X, Y, and Z are all true. And I don't know how that can coexist with your position. That's really helpful for me. I can say, oh, are those things true? Did I get this wrong? Go back. How do I weigh these things, these counterpoints, whatever? If you're saying like, you're not saying anything because you believe these two things that are diametrically opposed at the same time, or you're, giving credence to these two things that are diametrically opposed at the same time, that criticism means nothing to me. It's just, you're just upset because I didn't say what you wanted me to say. And I'm being honest about the process I'm going through and trying to understand a really complicated, difficult world. And a lot of these issues are really complicated. So, if you want the black and white, moral superior, we're the best, they suck, whatever, you can go get that at most other places. And that's just not what we're trying to do. And I think the fact that so much of that exists out there right now is exactly why the country's in the place that it is today. It's because everybody can go get their opinions reinforced in really black and white authoritative terms anywhere they want. It takes me 5 seconds of Googling to do that when I feel strongly about something, but it's way, way, way harder to say, actually, this isn't a simple issue. And it's really hard for me to hold, multiple things at once in my brain.
So I can imagine someone listening to this saying, well, it's probably easy or relatively simple to be able to have the Tangle newsletter and your perspective tackle soft issues, like the immigration bill or something broad, right? That feels like a squishy issue or not that relevant. But you actually, at least for me, the way that you got onto my radar big time was when you made your tweet about October 7th, right? And I want to use that as a case study to wrap this conversation up because I think it really outlines the process you take. And importantly, that tragic day was painful for many, and especially painful for you. And you outlined this in your Twitter post, in your thread. And there's a specific quote that you use. I was reading this last night. I just wanted to really get this right. So you said you concluded it with saying, "Am I pro-Israel or pro-Palestine? I have no idea." And then you go on to list, "But I am pro, not having buildings flattened. I am pro human rights. I'm pro having people be safely." Hoisted in their homes without feeling threatened. And you start off the newsletter saying, "I do not think there's any way to discuss the situation without being radically honest about my views." I guess my first question there is, how do you espouse that perspective, knowing that you have such deep emotional ties to what's going on? How did you go about presenting a nuanced perspective? I guess what I would call the Tangle way, right? while being so deeply connected to a conflict, because that is something we hear a lot today, that I can't have a nuanced perspective because my identity is tied to what's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, first of all, I think I've had a ton of practice, and the kind of Israel Palestine story and October 7th and the war that's happened since then in so many different ways is sort of like the Super Bowl for what I'm trying to do, because it's one of the most hotly contested, impossible to resolve issues that exists in the world. And I say it was the Super Bowl for me. It's like an inappropriate way to describe it in a lot of ways, but I say it because it was like the biggest challenge, like the championship game, the final level for me, to be able to approach this issue in a way where I can be true about myself and my feelings. I'm an American Jew. I lived in Jerusalem. I went to yeshiva. I am, consider myself a liberal Zionist. I could have been one of the people who got killed on October 7th. I went to music festivals like that when I lived in Israel. At the same time, I have Palestinian friends. I have Arab and Muslim friends. I have people who I met all through my experience traveling the area. I went to Hebron. I went to Egypt. I've been to these places where I've seen the sort of the despair caused by the Israeli government and the Israeli military occupation. And I understand how devastating everything that's happened since October 7th has been for a lot of those people who I care really deeply about. So it was an enormous challenge. I think I approach it with the attitude that I don't know everything. So, I'm always open-minded. I'm always here to hear, especially about Israel and Palestine. I've been writing about this subject publicly for 10 years. I've been thinking about it since I was in high school. I've read dozens of books and, millions of articles and podcasts, whatever. And every day I learn something new that sort of moves my position in some way, because there's just so much out there and it's such a rich, historical debate. At the same time, there's just this very human element of it. People are dying. There's a war, there's hostages, there's civilians and children being killed. So you have to sort of acknowledge all the human elements of it, acknowledge your own personal bias, acknowledge the emotional response you have, your readers are going to have, and then also give a kind of disassociated, academic perspective about what happens if X happens. Why did X happen? What if we do Y instead of X? Then where could that potentially get us based on these historical markers and things that have happened? And that's sort of how I approach it. So, for me, my process was write all the emotional stuff out first, how I was feeling, what I wanted, get that down on the page, step back, report the story, like put my reporter's hat on, leave the opinion stuff away, and just like do the neutral, what just happened on October 7th? What do we know about how Israel might respond? What got us here? And then go back to the kind of my take, the emotional part of it, and build around like what I want people to know about this conflict, how I want people to think about it, which for me, in the weeks that followed October 7th, before Israel's military operation started, was just about the fact that I wanted people to grasp how complex this was, that, you can hold two things at once. You can be really critical of the pending military operation, which I was. I knew it was going to be horrible because I knew how Israel's, government was going to respond to 1,400, 1,200 of its own civilians being killed. And also hold that, an organization like Hamas is not something any of us should accept as an organization leading a people or running a territory in 2024 in the modern world, and start there and then deal with it. Really complex, really difficult, really emotionally fraught process. Very grateful for my editors who, poke me and challenge my perspectives and pare back some of the emotion and encourage me to flesh thoughts out, because I'm saying broad-based, generalized things, on either side. And the piece that I publish, I got absolutely hammered by a lot of my readers who were Zionists, pro-Israel, religious Jews, whatever, my quote unquote community, who were just incensed that in the days after October 7th, some of the first stuff I wrote was warnings to Israel not to overreact militarily, which, you know, eight months later, I think from my perspective, what they've done has made the situation worse. And then I also got all this, you know, very angry, sort of incensed mail from my Palestinian and Muslim and, you know, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist readers who were like, I am dehumanizing Palestinians by conflating them with Hamas, or, you know, I'm talking about October 7th as if it happened in a vacuum and not talking about the occupation and all the years of, you know, the conflict that led up to it. I mean, it's like, you just accept that you're going to piss off a lot of people when you're sort of giving your, you know, a perspective that tries to embrace and tackle all these different arguments. And it was difficult. It was really hard. It's still really hard. It's, you know, of all the things that I write about and cover, it's the hardest, not because of my own personal investment, but because of how strongly so many people feel about it, and how black and white so many people view it. I mean, for most, not most, but for a lot of people, there was like one clear aggressor, evil person or group, and one clear, you know, victim. And for some people, the victim's Israel, and for some people, the victim is the Palestinian people. And it's really hard to talk to those people and take different sides and, you know, be somebody who is deeply confused. As a guest of mine recently described himself, which I thought was a really beautiful way of just saying, like, if you come to understand the totality of the conflict, the only way to leave is by feeling deeply confused, like, and conflicted. If you have any other feeling, then you're not reading enough. You haven't actually grasped what's going on, because it's a deeply confounding, perplexing, horrific situation. And there aren't really clear answers on either side. And that's my position, you know, and some people hate that and some people appreciate it.
I am deeply confused. To wrap up, how do you propose people feel more comfortable living in a state of feeling deeply confused? Because in some ways, that is deeply uncomfortable, as opposed to the state where you have one obvious aggressor that's evil, and then some other thing or country or person that is good.
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and I'm trying to find ways to articulate it, I guess, in a more concise or interesting way than I've been able to. For me,
well, here's a practice round. You got 2 minutes.
I find it really exciting and exhilarating, and I think it's really about reframing it. I think being unsure and being curious and wanting more answers is a really good place to be. You know, what's fun and exciting about a great TV show, series, or a movie, or, you know, going to a haunted house or whatever it is that you don't know what's coming around the next corner. You don't have a total grasp of where the story's going. And, you know, you watch like a great mystery show or a show that's sort of like a psychological thriller where the things you thought in the beginning of the show are different than the things you thought at the end. It's exciting because you look back on stuff you used to believe or used to think in episode 2, and in episode 9, it's totally different now. It's all reframed in different contexts. And if you approach the world that way, then it's really exciting. It's interesting to look back on something I wrote 2 years ago and be like, wow, I was totally wrong about that. And these 10 things have happened since then that have helped inform a totally different opinion I have. I find that exhilarating and, you know, scary and upsetting and all this different stuff that you also feel when you go through a haunted house or you watch a really terrifying show, but also exciting and interesting and compelling. And, you know, you learn from it. And that's kind of how I try and communicate it or think about it and give that to people, is just, it's okay to change your mind. It's okay to feel like you have this value-based system you've existed on for 20 years and look at it critically one day and think, oh, maybe I'm actually wrong. Maybe there are foundational things about this that don't actually inform what I believe or what my values are based on all the things I've learned and experienced. And that's okay. And so, what I try and do in the newsletter when I change my mind is I tell people when I get something wrong, I tell people. I don't do it with a footnote on, A20. I do it front and center in the newsletter. I make a big fuss about it. We got something wrong. Here's a correction. It's our 110th correction. Or, guess what? I changed my opinion about this issue we wrote about a year ago. I'm going to write a whole piece about why I changed my perspective. And people really love that.
That's
of all
awesome.
the kinds of, of all the things that we do, I think that kind of stuff gets the most positive response. And so my message to people is I'm doing it right now. I'm experimenting with this live and I'm getting a really positive response, and it's okay. Like, I can tell you from going through it that it's okay for you to also change your mind and also evolve in your position, and that people aren't going to kill you for it. You're not like a flip flopper or a turncoat or whatever. If you come to those views honestly, if like your opinion changes for honest reasons, not because, you want social clout or you got paid off or whatever it is, politicians flip flop for bad reasons all the time. But if you come to that position honestly, it's a really beautiful and profound thing. And it says a lot about the character of a person. And it's something that I'm trying to do every day. And I think I've gotten the positive reinforcement for it, which has made it a lot easier for me to do. And it's really intellectually stimulating and fun and exciting. And I like that part of my job.
Curiosity is like a haunted house, people. That's how you get America to just be perpetually curious. And importantly, I think in some ways, Isaac, you actually have more credibility making that claim, because the immediate top argument I often hear, especially in colleges and high schools, is young people telling me, well, Manu, I can't be deeply confused about a subject, especially when my identity is on the line. And you are speaking as both an American Jew, as someone that spent time in Israel, that's lived in Jerusalem. And you're articulating that in your case, yes, it was incredibly painful, incredibly challenging, and yet you find it to be the right way to necessarily approach such a complex issue. And I think that's an important thing for people to hear. And as we wrap this up, where can people find Tangle? How do they get tangled in the web that is Tangle?
Yeah, everything that you want to find is at readtangle.com. That's our main website. We have an old defunct Substack page that a lot of people still sign up for, and I have to go in there and export all those subscribers once a week. So readtangle.com is the real website. We moved off Substack a few years ago. And if you go to that website, you'll get hit with a landing page to sign up for our newsletter, which you can do for free. And we also have a podcast and a YouTube channel. And I'm on Twitter at Ike_Saul if anybody wants to follow me there.
And if you go to the old defunct Substack page, you're going to get transported into a curiosity haunted house. So don't do that. It's a trap door to hell where you're always deeply confused. Isaac, thank you so much for coming on The Hopeful Majority.
Thanks for having me, Manu. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Isaac for coming on the show. I appreciated his perspective. Importantly, this idea of being deeply confused, living in a state of deep confusion and being okay with it, being okay with the fact that we don't know everything, that it's okay to say, I don't know. I found that really powerful, because we live at this moment where we're forced to pick, forced to have an opinion, and forced to share our voice as loudly as possible. And maybe to a complex, nuanced problem set, that's not the right approach. Thank you so much for you to join and listen to this conversation. As we said at the start, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, leave a like, subscribe, leave a review. It really helps build the show, because you and I are going to take the Hopeful Majority to new heights, because we've got a political industrial complex, an outrage industrial complex to disrupt. And importantly, we've got to elevate nuance above outrage. We'll see you next week.